everyone, and welcome to this UCL Constitution Unit webinar on lessons from the 2024 general election. I'm Tom Fleming, a lecturer here at the Constitution Unit, and I will be chairing this session. So, the dust has just about settled on the 2024 general election. The UK now has a Labour government for the first time since 2010, and it will be laying out its first legislative programme tomorrow in the King's Speech. But the election raised all sorts of important questions about the campaign, the result, and the Parliament ahead. So we've assembled a brilliant panel to discuss those questions and more. Professor Ben Lauderdale is Professor of Political Science here at UCL and a leading expert on, among other things, polling and the measurement of public opinion. Professor Alan Renwick is the Deputy Director of the Constitution Unit, who will talk today about the conduct of the election and the working of the electoral system. Dr. Sofia Collignon, a senior lecturer in comparative politics at Queen Mary University of London, will then talk about the kinds of candidates who were selected and elected, before finally Professor Meg Russell, the Director of the Constitution Unit, will discuss what we can expect from this new Parliament. The way things will work is that we'll begin with each of our panellists making opening remarks of around 5 or 6 minutes, followed by some discussion among the panel. After that, we'll then open the floor to your questions. Those questions will be gathered today by my colleague, Hannah Kelly, who you can see on your screens. If you have a question that you'd like to put to a member of the panel, please do write it in the Q&A function on Zoom rather than the chat, and Hannah will then select a broad range of questions and read them out a few at a time. If you would like your question to be asked anonymously, please indicate that when you submit the question. And in that context, it might be worth noting that this whole session, including the Q&A, is being recorded, and it will be posted afterwards on the Constitution Unit website, our YouTube channel, and our podcast. But without any further ado, I'll hand over to our first speaker, Ben Lauderdale.
Okay, I'm just going to share some slides because I am going to be talking a bit about the election results, and it is useful to have some plots and some pictures to think about that. So the question I'm going to be answering is, in some sense, were these the election results we expected or should have expected shortly before the election? I'm going to be talking primarily about polling and in particular about seat level predictions. And I just want to start by saying that the 2024 election was in many ways a very difficult election to poll. We had the changes in context. It was the first sort of full or near full electoral cycle since the 2015 election. And unlike the last 3 elections, there were new boundaries. So many people found themselves in voting in somewhat different electoral contexts than they had in recent elections. And of course, there were major changes in politics. So we saw a collapse in the conservative vote versus what we saw at the 2019 election. We saw complex tactical voting considerations, Liberal Democrat versus Labor, conservative versus reform, and variations beyond that. We saw a new-ish party with 14% of the vote in the Reform Party. And we saw what turned out to be a pretty significant decline in turnout from 67% to around 60%. So there was a lot going on, some of which we didn't know in advance, some of which we saw evidence of it in advance. So this was both a tremendous opportunity for new polling methods, because this was not an election where things were simple and sort of one party was gaining a few percent everywhere and another party was losing a few percent everywhere. There were widely varying but very large swings happening in different parts of the UK. So large potential payoffs to seat level modeling, but also a lot of opportunities to get the modeling very wrong and potentially mislead people about what was likely to happen. So as many of you will know, much of the seat level modeling that is done via a method which is usually referred to as MRP, because multi-level regression and post-stratification is a bit of a mouthful. What this kind of method does is it uses modeling of individual level vote intention. So when you survey people in a poll, you ask them how they're going to vote, you use that data to make seat and thus national level predictions. And you do that through 2 steps. The first is to look for patterns in how people are voting as a function of how they voted in the past, the constituency characteristics of the place where they live, and their individual characteristics, age, education, and so on. That's often done by multi-level regression. Sometimes it's used through other methods that aim to do something similar. And then there's a second stage called post-stratification, where you take that model of how people's votes are changing and you map that out onto the electorate as a whole. This has become increasingly popular in the UK over recent cycles. We've gone from 2 of these in 2017 to about 4 in 2019 to about 8 this time. Probably will not continue to double indefinitely, but it's become a very popular method of trying to answer the key question that we care about in UK politics, which is how will voting behavior map out onto seats, and thus what sort of government will form. So in this cycle, we saw some patterns, as in previous cycles, where the polls were systematically wrong. So I'm looking here at 5 of the MRPs that were published in early July, just before the election. And they all pretty much over predicted the Labour vote share. And they had smaller errors on other parties. So they tended to slightly underpredict the Conservatives, the Lib Dems, the Greens, and people voting for other parties. When you translate this out into seats, you see they tended to overpredict Labour, although they all broadly got the picture of a very substantial Labour majority right. They tended to underpredict the Conservatives, tended to underpredict the Lib Dems, overpredict the SNP. So these those are sort of the big national picture. But I think what's really interesting about these kinds of analyses is what you learn when you look down at the seat level. So I'm going to show you a series of plots, and I'm going to try to explain them in words very quickly so I can hand over to my colleagues. The plot in the upper left here is in some sense the key story of the entire election, which is that Labour's vote changed very differently in different kinds of constituencies. So if you look at the left of the plot, at the places where in 2019 they had very little of the vote, they generally didn't make substantial gains. Those are heavily places where the Lib Dems were the primary opposition to the Conservatives. Then in the middle left of the plot, places where Labour had 20 to 40% of the vote last time, they made very substantial gains, which is where all those seat pickups come from. And then what's notable is above 40% of the vote in 2019, all the places that are traditional Labour strongholds, they didn't really gain much vote at all. And in fact, in most of those places, they lost vote. So what you see is a picture which is almost perfectly designed to maximize seat gains without significant vote gains across the country as a whole. Labour gained vote in the places where they needed it to win seats, and they lost vote in the places where they could afford to lose vote without losing seats for the most part. Did the MRPs predict any of this? The answer is yes. To varying degrees, the different MRP polls picked up on these patterns. They didn't quite get all of it in most cases, but here I've got 5 plots that show you on the x-axis the predicted vote share, what these what the MRP said for a given constituency would be the Labour vote, and on the y-axis the actual vote share that resulted. And ideally, these would be a bunch of points along the diagonal, and in maybe 1 or 2 cases they come close to that. But they, by and large, were far better predictions of where Labour would end up than if you had simply looked back to 2019, applied an increase across the board, and thought that was going to be the Labour vote. When we look at other parties, we see different patterns. Lots of things were happening in this election. The Conservatives lost vote proportionately sort of across the board. So they lost a little bit of vote in the places they were weak last time. They lost a lot of vote in the places they were strong. And the MRPs basically picked this pattern up. So there were some inaccuracies in the details. The levels are a little bit off, but by and large, the vote shares that were realized for the Conservatives were pretty close and pretty much in line with those that were predicted by most of these modeling exercises. Reform, similarly, because of that pattern of sort of proportional loss from the Conservatives, that sort of across lots of kinds of seats, some fraction of the people who voted Conservative went Reform, you see pretty good prediction, again, somewhat varying in quality across provider. The Lib Dems are interesting because they were underpredicted by many of these models, although again, not all. And that's in some ways connected to some of the misses that occurred for the Labour vote and for some parties. So I don't have time to go into tons more detail. If there are questions, I can pick up some of them. I'm going to skip quickly past the Greens and SNP and just say, I think there were a lot of people who saw the result on election day and thought, oh, well, these models all over-predicted labor. They didn't really get this right. And I think that's not quite the right way to look at it. I think in some ways this was a polling failure that wasn't. All the models got the primary story correct, which was a massive change since 2019, a big labor majority, and historically large gains in seat totals in particular, due to the way that vote was distributed. There was the collapse of the conservative vote and seat totals, with votes heavily going to reform. And the seat level predictions were themselves much more informative than simply looking to 2019 notional results. No one was misled by looking at these MRP results relative to how misled they might have been if they'd simply looked at the 2019 results. At the same time, these models missed secondary stories to varying degrees. They overstated the labor vote. They understated labor vote share losses to the Greens, independents, and particularly so in traditional labor strongholds. They understated the strength of the Lib Dem tactical vote, and they understated SNP losses. So I'm going to leave it there. I've probably talked for too long already. Thanks to Tom and Matthew for getting the data together, and apologies to anyone I might have maligned unfairly due to putting this together at speed.
We'll move straight on to how the election itself actually unfolded with Alan.
Thanks very much, Tom. So I'll say something about four aspects of the performance of the electoral system and the electoral process. So the first of those is the performance of first past the post. And this, as many people will have realized by now, is by a wide margin the most disproportional election result that we have seen, at least since 1945. I do have some graphs, but I'm not going to put them up on the screen. If you want to see them, I've just put a link to a blog post that I did last week in the chat, and you can see the graphs there. So Labour won a landslide victory, despite having the lowest share of the vote for any winning party since before the Great Reform Act of 1832. So it got 63% of the seats on only just over a third of the votes overall, while all other political parties in Great Britain were underrepresented, some only slightly, but most starkly, of course, Reform UK, which had just over 14% of the votes, but just 5 seats, so fewer than 1% of the seats. Now, all of that clearly bolsters the case for reform to a more proportional electoral system. But such reform isn't going to happen anytime soon. And that's partly because the Labour leadership is not going to want to change a system that has just given them a landslide victory. But it's also because, although, yes, the election result bolsters the case for reform, it also actually bolsters the case for first past the post as well. The main argument for that system is that it allows the voters, rather than post-election negotiations between political parties, to decide who will govern. And it does that typically by giving a single party a majority of parliamentary seats, so that voters can throw out a government they dislike and install another one. Now, the system doesn't always do that actually as well as its cheerleaders would have us believe, but in this election delivered the most decisive transition of the post-war era. We moved from a Conservative government initially with a majority of 80 to a Labour government with a majority of 174. So first past the post did what it's supposed to do. And the election illustrated the arguments both for and against first past the post. The debate about electoral reform is, as always, a double-sided one. Our second point is on election administration. We held a seminar here in the unit in April when the Deputy Chief Executive of the Association of Electoral Administrators, Laura Locke, talked about the perilous state of election administration in the UK. And actually on the day, the administration of the vote and the count went pretty smoothly. The process has subsequently been described, however, by the AEA's Chief Executive, Peter Stanion, as beyond tough for returning officers because of all they had to deal with. And certainly there were big problems with postal voting, with many people not receiving their ballots on time. Just how far that was due to overstretched administration or post office failures or more structural problems, only time will show. And the Electoral Commission is investigating this and it will report in due course. The two remaining aspects of the process that I wanted to talk about both relate to campaign discourse. The first of these is on the intimidation and abuse of candidates, campaigners, and poll workers. And appallingly abusive behaviour has certainly taken place in the course of this election. The Electoral Commission, again, is now gathering evidence. We should be a bit wary of drawing specific conclusions until the Commission has published its report. And actually we'll get further evidence from Sofia in a moment as well. But it is clear that there is a serious problem that needs deep thinking, not just about election rules, but more broadly about how we communicate with each other in politics and wider society. It was striking that Rishi Sunak and many losing candidates were praised for their grace and magnanimity in defeat on the 5th of June. But we really should ask, why cannot candidates on all sides have shown more respect and civility during the campaign as well as immediately afterwards? And that's not just a rhetorical question, it's also a real question. Why can't they do it? Candidates engage in negative campaigning, at least in part because they think it works, because it'll give them more votes. So we have to think about our responsibilities as voters and what it is that attracts us and sways who we're going to vote for. Finally, the final aspect that I wanted to talk about, second aspect of campaign discourse, is misinformation and disinformation. So certainly here there were specific misleading claims made by campaigners during the campaign. Conservatives, for example, said that analysis by civil servants showed that Labour would have to raise taxes by £2,000 per working household, when in fact, famously, the numbers were not really determined by civil service analysis, and the figure of £2,000 was both unreliable and misleading. And similarly, Labour made claims about the impact of its policies on electricity bills that were found to be outdated and misleading. Perhaps more serious, however, was the failure of all parties to engage with likely choices between tax rises and spending cuts. And this is what Paul Johnson from the Institute for Fiscal Studies called a conspiracy of silence. As our research on public attitudes to democracy has shown over the last few years, when people rail against politicians' dishonesty, they're complaining not just about lies, they're also complaining about dissembling and spin. And yet dissembling and spin is often what they got. So again, it's important to think about what can be done about this. I've been arguing for quite some time that we need to improve the availability of high quality, impartial information. And actually, we've seen quite big strides towards this. So for example, the expert analysis of the Institute for Fiscal Studies was more prominent in this election than in any previous one. BBC Verify was doing great work. Democracy Club, the volunteer body that does the Who Can I Vote For website, and various others, was doing great work. The Electoral Commission increased the information as Ben has that it made available. As Ben has just said, the MRPs were helpful for voters in understanding the votes in their constituencies. So there was lots going on. But clearly these things are not enough in themselves, and sometimes indeed they were being gamed by campaigners. So we do have to think about more fundamental responses to these challenges as well, around education, the role of the BBC, potentially the role of citizens' assemblies in helping to model better forms of deliberation. And to me, rather depressingly little attention has been given to these matters, either during the campaign or since. And these are areas of our electoral processes where I think we do need further research and then action in the coming period. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Well, thanks very much, Alan. Lots of food for thought there. Sofia is our next speaker, who's going to talk about the candidates.
Hi, thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. I'm going to group my talk around three main topics. The first is the experience of candidates, the representation of women and ethnic minorities, and also future challenges. Well, I'm going to start by mentioning that the general election was the largest, during this general election, we saw the largest number of candidates standing for office. We saw that using data from the Democracy Club, we can see that a total of 4,526 candidates stood from office this time. This is a record, and it also is an increase of 36 percentage points compared to 2019. Now, who are these candidates standing? So for more than half of the candidates, this is their first election standing. So we are talking about a huge group of new novice candidates for which this was the first election. Now, the proportion is very close to 50% in the case of conservatives and liberal Democrats. So we saw, again, like half and half of them are what we call experienced candidates, and half of them are candidates that are new. But in the case of Labour, we see that the proportion is significantly larger, with 58% of the candidates being new. Now, this new influx of people in politics also means that we are observing the youngest pool of candidates. So on average, candidates in this general election were 50 years old, which means that they are 4 years younger than the average observed in 2019. And we have been seeing the age being decreasing over time. So in terms of gender representation, well, what we see is that 32% of the candidates were women. This is a decrease of 2 percentage points compared to 2019. Now, the fact that it's a decrease of 2 percentage points, we might think that this is a very small decrease. However, this is the first time that we observe a decrease in the proportion of women standing for office since at least 2010. Now, in 2019, Labour was the first candidate that put forward more women than men to stand for office. While this is not the case in 2024, when we only see that 46% of Labour candidates were women, we have to remember that this time the Labour could not use the all women shortlists. So we also need to ask whether we still need some institutional provisions to improve gender representation there. Now, something positive is that more women were standing in winnable seats, and this really translates into a 41% of parliamentarians being women. Now, we are still far away from the landmark 50-50, which will be closer to the descriptive representation in terms of sex in the UK, but still, this is progress and it should be celebrated. In terms of ethnic minority representation, well, it's very difficult to really code and have a proportion of candidates from ethnic minority backgrounds at this stage. But what we can see is that a record of 90 ethnic minority MPs have been elected. We see that the majority of them are women compared to men, and this basically is an increase of 24 new MPs that are from an ethnic minority background. Now, this means that in terms of descriptive representation, the descriptive representation of ethnic minorities in the UK is coming closer to what we can expect if we see at the general population. So we have 13.8% of MPs coming from an ethnic minority background, and it's estimated that 14% of the UK electorate comes from an ethnic minority background. So we can see that we are basically there. Now, again, women outnumber men among ethnic minority MPs, with 50 of these ethnic minority MPs being women and 40 are men. Now, I would like to close my talk by pinpointing to some of the challenges that I can see based on the information that I have been given. So the first one is the importance of still pay attention to the supply and demand side of candidate selection. So we need a electorate that is prepared to put forward diverse number of candidates in terms of age, gender, ethnicity, and sexuality. The past efforts have been fruitful, and I think it is important to highlight this and highlight that when we remove the institutional provisions, sometimes we might, so maybe we are not yet on the point when we have changed completely culture and expectations, but we need to still make efforts. Now, in the terms of the fact that the majority of that more than 50% of the candidates were new candidates, and that translated into a parliament where a very large proportion of parliamentarians are also newcomers, we will see a lot of politicians that lack experience and will need support on how to on knowledge about parliamentarian procedures, but also perhaps the unspoken conventions that are that they will have to be navigating soon. There is an importance of addressing the issue of abuse, harassment, and intimidation. In 2019, we saw that more than half of the candidates suffer of any form of abuse, harassment, and intimidation while in campaign. And despite of different initiatives, codes of conduct, an investigation from the Electoral Commission, and pledges, and also the commitment of parties to provide training to candidates, what we still see is that the issue is rival. Which indicates as well that we need to do something that creates a more coherent response and also revise laws and procedures for reporting, and at the same time to think about how can we improve civility in public life. This is important and it should be tackled from a more holistic perspective. Now, this is not only important during the campaign time, it's also important to address bullying, a culture of bullying and abuse, harassment, and intimidation while in Parliament, because right now what we see is new talent coming forward, people that are passionate about politics, that really want to do to create a change, and that are still interested in becoming, and being part of the public life of the country. And we really need to make a huge effort to make them feel that they can really achieve the change that they are there to make, but also to provide them the necessary support, because we want to retain all this new talent that we are generating now. So I'm going to stop here. I'm looking forward for the questions.
Wonderful. Thanks very much. There's loads there for us to discuss in a moment, but before we do, I'll just turn over to our last panelist, which is Meg.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you very much to the other speakers as well. My role in wrapping up what we're saying as a panel is to just say a few words about the new parliament that results from this election. And I thought I would focus on three things which are unusual aspects of the election. One Sofia has just referred to, the fact that we have so many new members. Secondly, the unusual timing of the election. And then thirdly, the size of the government's majority and the relative smallness of the opposition. So on the first of those, the number of new members is very, very high. The highest, certainly in any post-war election. We've got 335 new members of the House of Commons. More than half of members are new. There were fewer than 250 new members even in 1997 when Labour won a landslide victory. So this is really, really big. Obviously, this is going to result in a very large amount of upheaval. You've got a lot of people moving out. You've got a lot of new people moving in, a lot of offices to be allocated, people to be given their computers, their passwords, their passes, and all of that. And just a thought to the poor staff. We published a report late last year by Rebecca McKee on MP staff. They're entirely dependent on the MP, with around about 250 Conservative MPs departing Parliament. That's over 1,000 people who are going to be losing their jobs, and like those MPs, landing onto the job market. One perhaps interesting angle on that is whether the turnover of MPs' staff is also going to see an increase in diversity, as Sofia just referred to, because Rebecca's work showed that staff were, research staff in particular, were disproportionately male, that Conservative staff had rather disproportionately gone to private schools. So we may see a greater diversification of those who work for MPs as well as MPs themselves. But the most obvious thing to come away from this, to me, is something that, again, Sofia already referred to, which is there's going to be a massive need for induction and training of all of these new MPs. This is something that we dedicated a recent seminar to during the election campaign. There are some real challenges in the competition for MPs' time and all of the various things that they need to learn to do the job well. There are clearly sort of opportunities and threats in a high turnover. There's a risk of a loss of institutional memory. There's also a risk or perhaps an opportunity for a change of culture. You know, there are things that we haven't liked so much about our culture in recent years.
Sorry, Meg, I think others from their facial expressions are having the same issue, that they can't hear you.
Yes, something, where did we, do you need me to pick up at a particular point?
Yeah, I think you suggested...
It's flashing on and off that I'm unmuting, and I don't know why.
Sorry, I think we got you to the point where you'd said there's some problems with the culture in recent years.
Yeah, okay. This massive turnover allows the opportunity for cultural change, which could mean that we can move away from some of the things we haven't liked about recent years, or it could, on the other hand, mean that they become entrenched because you've got people who've learnt these new ways. A brief word on timing, which is obviously very unusual in this election. This is something that I put something on the Constitution Unit blog about on the day before Election Day. A July election, very unusual, hasn't happened since 1945. We've now got, from today, Parliament only sitting for a couple more weeks, even though the King's Speech is happening tomorrow. So after we've had the debates on the King's Speech, there's not going to be time for much more business before Parliament breaks up. We know that next week there's going to be election of the deputy speakers, but we won't see, for example, election of the select committees until the autumn, and various other things won't really be getting going until the autumn. What I suggested in that blog post, it was arguing in praise of post-election transition periods, that this does offer an opportunity. It offers an opportunity at the government level for new ministers to get settled into their briefs and get to know their civil servants and prepare policy proposals. But also it offers opportunities for MPs to do some of that preparation for these new jobs. And I do think this might be something that we look back on as a pleasant change in politics, and we might want to think about replicating at future elections, having something of a break. On the size of the majority, there's been quite a lot said about this. Obviously, there were the fears of the so-called supermajority in advance and all sorts of questions about what might happen. I think this is important both on the opposition side and the government side. So starting with the opposition side, there was talk of the possibility that maybe the Conservatives wouldn't be the second largest party in the House of Commons, which was sending some of us sort of proceduralists a bit panicky about all the things that would change if that happened. Well, it didn't change. So that much remains straightforward. But there are only 121 Conservative MPs, which is a very small main opposition party. And I think that the Conservatives are going to somewhat struggle to fill all their front bench positions, as well as things like deputy speaker roles on select committees. There are going to be very few kicking around who are just sort of straight backbenchers. And a number of people, including the unit's Lisa James on the UK and a Changing Europe blog yesterday, have pointed out the fragmented nature of the opposition as well, in that the Conservatives are only just over 50% of opposition MPs. Alongside that 121, there are 117 others, including 72 Liberal Democrats. They're not far beyond the Tories. This raises some questions about the sharing out of things at Westminster. One of the most obvious ones is that standing orders very much privilege the official main opposition in handing out opposition days. There are 20 opposition days per session, 17 of which go to the first party, and only 3 of which go to the second and minor opposition parties. Paul Evans, writing for the Hansard Society, has also raised the question of the so-called usual channels, which are effectively a channel between the government and the main opposition party. But there are many others on the opposition side who've got a decent claim to be included in these discussions about what gets programmed at Westminster. Speaking time is also interesting and is more at the discretion of the speaker. But Erskine May does suggest that normally speaking time will alternate between the government side and the opposition side, which risks being rather unfair to government backbenchers when there are so many of them. So there's quite a lot to untangle there. On the government side, there are somewhat the opposite problems to on the opposition side. They've got so many people that some will be on the front bench, some will be chairing select committees or on select committees, but there's going to be quite a lot of backbenchers who haven't got any allocated role aside from being just a constituency MP. And obviously this does risk the possibility that they are a bit discontented. It's difficult to run such a large group, that it fragments, it factionalizes, that you see more opposition on the government's own benches. So I think a challenge for the government will be finding things for backbenchers to do. And one of the interesting things which Tom has written about is this idea that was in the Labour manifesto of a modernisation committee looking at procedural innovations. And the sort of thing that could be done perhaps is to set up new committees to give those people more policy development work to do, so that they've got some really kind of constructive things to get on with whilst on the backbench. I'll just say one word about the dynamic with the House of Lords, because I think we focus a lot on the House of Commons, understandably, because it's just been elected. But one of the effects of having an overwhelming government majority in the House of Commons may well be that the House of Lords feels that there's something of a vacuum in terms of opposition and wishes to step in and take a more active role. It's notable that while the Conservatives have only 121 MPs, they've got more than double that number in the House of Lords, and they can be really quite effective there. And so I think the House of Lords will become more active. And I think in turn, the Labour government is very aware of that, and that we may see as a result of that an improvement, as the new leader of the House of Commons has stressed, of standards of preparation of legislation and so on, and higher standards of scrutiny, in order that they don't fall into the trap of the House of Lords saying this hasn't been scrutinized properly and it's our job to take it to pieces. And I've spoken for too long. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Meg. Lots there to reassure us that Parliament's certainly not going to be boring after the election. Not that we ever think Parliament's boring here at the Constitution Unit. So we'll turn to audience questions in 15 minutes or so. And thank you for the questions that have already been submitted so far. I can see there are lots coming in, but if you haven't submitted one yet, now is the time to do so. Please just remember to pop it in the Q&A function on Zoom. But before we turn to your questions, I'll put a few questions of my own to the panel. First of all, I think this is a question for Ben, though Alan may also have views on it. You mentioned the various reasons why this election might have been a tricky one to poll due to boundary changes, new parties, questions about tactical voting. But we also saw quite a lot of discussion about the idea that voters had been pretty good at tactically voting when they wanted to. And so I wondered if we do actually have any sort of good evidence yet on how far we saw that in the results.
It's a little difficult to pick out of the aggregate results at this point, really strong evidence. But I think one of the places you see evidence of effective tactical voting is that in those places where it was relatively clear whether Labour or the Lib Dems were better situated to make a gain against the Conservatives, the other party, whichever it was, tended to have their vote share remain very low. So you didn't see sort of what you might call inefficient gains for third place parties when it was that particular combination. And I think there's a good deal of evidence that that reflects choices that the parties made about where to campaign intensely and where not to campaign intensely, as well as choices that voters made on the basis of 2019 results or notional 2019 results, or indeed potentially from sort of some of the information that was being made available for them. And we may come on to the question of whether all of that information was entirely accurate and what we should make of that. But I think on that side, you see pretty strong evidence of effective tactical voting. In some sense, the Conservative losses to reform show what happens in the absence of effective tactical voting. The Conservative losses to reform were about as bad as they could be for the Conservatives without them gaining reform very many seats. And that sort of split is sort of a disaster under first past the post. At the same time, in order to have tactical voting, you partly need the parties to play along in how they campaign, and you partly need the voters to play along in how they think about their choices. And I think for a whole host of reasons, that was very unlikely to occur when you're thinking about how the Conservative vote might break to reform. The parties were not in a position in terms of thinking about the broader politics to do any kind of coordination. And the voters who were switching from the Conservatives to reform were not doing so from a mindset of trying to maximize the joint seats of the Conservative Party and the Reform Party.
Great, thank you. Then maybe following exactly from that, you sort of hinted already that there are questions on whether the information voters were getting from the various MRP estimates and so on were sort of accurate and useful in helping them guide their voting choices. Do you have any thoughts on that, as you hinted you might?
Yes, I mean, this may be sort of stealing some of the questions from the audience, but I think one of the things that you have in this situation is in a first past the post system with huge electoral swings like the ones in this cycle. it's really the case that people often don't know how it is sensible to deploy their vote. It's very difficult in the absence of any information. And so I do think what we can see in the data is that the MRPs were more accurate than the sort of straightforward application of past results. And so to the extent that people looked at those, even the less good ones, they would have been pushed in a direction that bore a closer resemblance to what happened than if they had simply projected forward the 2019 results in a sort of more naive, uniform swing kind of way. So in that sense, I think the MRPs were accurate enough to not mislead relative to what people knew already. That's not going to be the case in every single seat. And you might, it might be that there are particular seats where people may have made wrong choices. I suspect that most of those were going to be cases where it was a genuinely difficult problem to figure out which parties were likely to make the largest gains and which were not. And so I think when you're evaluating whether tactical voting information, MRPs, et cetera, are good, are accurate enough to not mislead, you do have to think about like what is the alternative of what people would have been working with in the absence of that information.
Yeah, if maybe I can add in, I certainly had some concerns during the course of the campaign that voters in at least some constituencies were being bombarded with information of mixed quality as a result of the MRPs. And if you knew what was happening on the ground in terms of knowing which parties were campaigning where, and what was being thought by people who were in touch with the constituency dynamics, then there were certainly a number of constituencies that some MRPs were producing wildly inaccurate predictions for, as the result subsequently proved. I mean, I guess it is the case that if you look at the results, then on the whole, those constituencies, voters kind of managed to work it out anyway. And I guess that may be an indication that the bigger signals that voters were getting in those kinds of constituencies were coming from the campaigners and just the number of leaflets that were dropping through their letterboxes, and less from the MRPs and that kind of information. So I guess it worked out largely in the end, but I think there are certainly lots of lessons for the MRP modelers to learn from this election, and particularly given that but given the way in which MRPs are being used now by campaigners and indeed voters and tactical voting websites, they're being used not just in order to work out what is the national seat distribution going to be, which they're pretty good at. They're also being used to make these individual seat level predictions, and therefore it's really important to be able to capture the individual seat level dynamics rather than just the changes that different kinds of voters, so not just the individual level dynamics, but also the constituency level dynamics. And I think some of the models appeared to me to be better at doing that than others.
Thanks, Anna. Yeah, I was certainly struck by how the proliferation of different estimates meant that, so in my constituency, I saw one of the parties trying to unseat the incumbent, showing data that did accord with reality, that said they were best placed to do it, whilst the incumbent was sharing data that claimed the opposite, in what was, it seemed, more of an attempt to actually split the opposition vote by sending some votes to the less well-placed candidate. So both sides were using it. Perhaps we could stick with this question of election coverage of polling, since you talked about the discourse of the campaign, and Ben highlighted how much more polling, or particularly how many more MRP polls there were during this campaign. I wonder, Alan, do you have thoughts on whether there was too much discussion of polls in the discourse? Does this have useful consequences for voters, or does it crowd out other things they might more usefully discuss?
Gosh, it's also always a question that's being debated. I mean, you want voters in an election to be focusing in a very kind of serious-minded way on the serious issues, so that the policy debates that are there, and also questions of character around the candidates and the leaders and so on. But this is a first past the post electoral system, and in a first past the post electoral system, tactical considerations at the level of the constituency are important and vitally important for shaping the result. And if you this was very clearly an election in which a large majority of voters wanted to have a different government. But how to vote in order to achieve that goal was very different in different constituencies. And it seems to me perfectly legitimate, given that we've got first past the post, that voters should have that information so that they can make an informed choice about that, as well as about all the other things that are relevant in an election.
Thank you. And then just a quick further question that sort of goes back a bit, or I suppose, to the tactical voting question. Do we know how well different parties did at coming second in this election? We, for obvious reasons, focus on who wins in these seats, but there seems to have been some discussion that the Lib Dems did so well that they're now second in very few places, whilst Reform did well enough that they're second in quite a lot. But I'm not sure quite sort of how good the evidence yet is on that, who's gone through the numbers and totted it up.
Yeah, I was going to say just what you just said. So the most striking things are that, yeah, the Lib Dems did very well in 2019, not in winning seats, but in getting second places. And that gave them a foundation to, to say to people, we're the people to vote for in these constituencies. And, going back to your first question on tactical voting, I think Ben didn't mention the Lib Dems, but the Lib Dems did spectacularly well in inducing tactical voting in the seats in which they were campaigning. But they have pretty much maxed out now, and they don't have very many second places. I don't have a number. I don't know if anyone else does have a number, but they don't have very many. Whereas Reform have lots of second places. Lots of second places in the north of England, in the east of England, in South Wales, which is something that hasn't really been talked about terribly much. So they have a significant foundation to build on. If Labour disappoints in power, then the potential for Reform to move up is really quite big.
Thanks. Do you have any thoughts on what that means in terms of the party management challenges you were discussing, in terms of the different directions in which Labour MPs might be pulled across the coming Parliament?
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, clearly all MPs are subject to their own kind of individual constituency pressures. And we saw that, and it's not just the Reform pressures, is it? We saw these pressures from the, I'm not sure how we group them, the pro-Gaza independent candidates, perhaps, who unseated some Labour MPs and brought other Labour MPs quite close to that. Just is an indication of how much people have to kind of watch their backs according to the individual constituency level characteristics. And I'm sure that when MPs are planning what they're going to do in Parliament, what they're going to emphasise policy-wise, as well as how they're going to behave locally, they're going to be taking those things very much into account. And there will be some natural kind of groups of MPs who are subject to the same sorts of pressures. I mean, we saw this in the last Parliament, didn't we, with the so-called Red Wall Conservative MPs who were kind of grouping together and trying to push the leadership in certain directions. So I haven't quite figured all of that out yet, what those groupings will be, but I'm sure that we will see some of those dynamics. And obviously, it is the nature, I mentioned the risk of fragmentation on the Labour side. We've had a lot of fragmentation on the Conservative side in recent parliaments. Actually, in a way, the very shrinkage of the party, although the Conservative Party still feels very divided, the fact that there are only 121 members has a sort of natural cohesive sort of effect. I think they are all going to feel rather more part of one team than perhaps they did when they were bigger, because a lot of them are going to be on the front bench. Whereas on the Labour side, the pressures are very different. And I think it's just a sort of human characteristic that large groups, a group of 400, cannot be held together as a cohesive entity, no matter who those people are and where they are. So there will be some fragmentation, but I think that the challenge for the leadership is to put that to constructive use rather than to become sort of oppressed by it. So, if you can get people into policy groupings, for example, where they're doing interesting work, thinking about how policy might develop to inform the leadership, that's good. If they're breaking up into one group that are trying to drag you to the left and the other group that are trying to drag you to the right, pretty familiar from the Conservative Party in recent years, it gets very difficult. And it's not even just bipolar now, is it? It's multiple directions.
Thank you. Then I could come back to Sofia and pick up on something that you mentioned about all-in shortlists. So you suggested that we'd seen a fall in the proportion of candidates that were female, but an increase in the number of MPs. And you suggested that Labour this time round couldn't use all women's shortlists. So I wondered if you could just expand on why that was and whether we actually might see them again at the next election.
So all women shortlists were used by the Labour Party for the past, I think, 20 years or around 20 years to try to encourage more women to stand for office. And also not only to encourage them from the, to activate their political ambition, but also to encourage selectors to put forward more women. So we have seen consistently an increase in the number of women put forward for election, mainly also or facilitated by the all women shortlists. Now in 2019, for the first time, the Labour Party, and I'm sorry, but just coming back for a second, this was possible because according to the law, you can positively discriminate a group if the group is underrepresented. Now in 2019, for the first time, Labour put forward more women than men as candidates, which means that you cannot apply the all women shortlist because then that became illegal. It's no longer underrepresented in numbers. So for this election, the all women shortlist had to be removed. And it was deemed to be as also like a kind of a natural experiment to see whether the all women shortlists were making the difference or not. And what we see is, yes, there is some level of sustained progress in the selection of women candidates, but the fact that we are saying a 2%, like some decrease on the numbers, means that we are not yet there when we can take for granted like the representation of women there. So it might be possible to see them coming back in the future because technically women will be underrepresented again, but I don't think that the party will, if I am allowed to speculate, I don't think that the party will be doing it anytime soon. So maybe we will see the effect of removing the lists in this and the next election.
Great, and I just Meg, what you were going to come in?
Yeah, I just thought it might be worth coming in here to mention something that I don't think Sofia did emphasize, which is how unevenly distributed the women in the new parliament are. Labour is on 46%, the Lib Dems are on 44%, I believe. And then the two small oppositions, Green and Plaid, have 3 women and 1 man each. But then the Conservatives are on less than a quarter. And then you have 5 Reform MPs who are all men, 6 independent MPs who are all men, and the SNP are down to 8 men and 1 woman. So actually, Labour and the Liberal Democrats are the ones who are pulling the numbers upwards, and there are other parties that still have a long way to go.
Yeah, that's exactly what I've been about to comment on as well. It's the fact that rather than a sort of rising tide across all the parties, in a way, it's the party shift that has led to some of these, it seems, increases in diversity. And maybe just a last question then to you, Meg, before we go to the audience. And that was perhaps to play devil's advocate a little bit on your praise of transition periods, where you've suggested this could be a good chance for government and parliament to settle in. I've been quite struck that often those who sort of support parliamentary scrutiny criticise governments for making lots of announcements outside parliament. And one of the solutions perhaps we often advocate is that they should be making more of their announcements in parliament where they can be scrutinised. And over the last week or so, and I suspect over the next few weeks, I feel we've been seeing lots and lots of government announcements, but parliament's not yet up and running. And so I wonder, how far is there a risk that this timing means what we get is lots of government for a few months and not a lot of parliament, and consequently not a lot of scrutiny of that government?
Yes, I totally accept that is a tension. It's quite hard to hold back, isn't it, a new government from making lots of excited announcements when it's just got into office. So you're quite right, and I think that the same thing applies actually on the select committee. As I mentioned, that the select committees are not likely to be elected until the autumn, and I was the specialist advisor to the thing that we generally call the Right Committee, which very much emphasised the need to get select committees up and running as quickly as possible after an election. But actually, I rather welcome the fact that that isn't happening until the autumn, because the alternative is that you have an election now, whereas I've already said more than half of the members of parliament are new. They don't know who they're voting for, and they don't know what they might want to stand for. So I think it's actually, the way it's worked out this time is rather good. I would hope, we'll have to see. This is, again, a kind of natural experiment, isn't it? How much politics is there going to be in August? This is a dilemma for the government itself, I think. Obviously in the in the immediate aftermath of an election, there's nothing unusual in lots of policy announcements, and then Parliament will be back and there will be scrutiny of particularly of the broad direction of the King's speech before it breaks up for the summer. Are they then going to keep up that momentum over August, or are they going to think we could do with a break? And frankly, the public could probably do with a break. So let's allow people to have August and then regroup in September. And I think if it's the latter, that falls into my kind of healthy model. If they do keep up an announcement a day throughout August, I may come to regret that I said it by the time we get to the autumn.
So I think we'll turn now to the audience questions, as I can see there's lots coming in. So hopefully Hannah will appear magically back on our screens. And Hannah, have you got a few questions for us to start off with?
Yes, we've got Hope Pinwani says, is there evidence from the election that parties are getting better at targeting their efforts on the seats they need to win? We've had a few questions on voter ID. As this was the first general election conducted with voter ID, is there any evidence that it had an impact, especially given the low turnout? And Chris Naylor said, might the high proportion of novice candidates strengthen the case for some universal basic training at the candidate stage to support effective electoral process, in addition to the induction which those elected as MPs subsequently receive?
Okay, great questions. So let's take those in the order in which they came. The first one was about whether we know that about parties getting better at targeting seats. So I don't know if either of Alan or Ben want to come in on that one, or both.
I'm happy to come in. I mean, we both spoke to this a little bit already. I mean, they're the big success stories in this election. The Lib Dems, in many ways, Labour vis-a-vis the Lib Dems, sort of not targeting seats where Labour was better situated. And sort of, the Green Party was very successful in sort of identifying a few seats where they had real opportunities and making, disproportionate gains in those places. I think we also saw just the sort of the challenges of doing that. Certainly, the challenges of doing that in the context where your party is losing votes as opposed to gaining votes, and where the electoral situation is less clear. So I think, in some ways, it's it's been demonstrated that it can be very effective given the right circumstances, given a context where it's relatively clear how the targeting ought to go, and sort of clear to the voters and clear to all the parties involved. I think where that isn't true, you see muddier results, and sort of results where people look back and they say, oh, this doesn't, there are a lot of people who would change their votes if they could see how this came out, because they would have liked a different result. And there are, because of the way they break down, that really might change the outcome, even if everyone got to reconsider. So you certainly have a fair number of those as well. But I think that there are real limitations on what's possible in advance of an election that depend on both the public and the parties.
Thanks. Alan, do you want to pick up on that, and possibly also the question on voter ID in Great Britain for the first time in a general election?
Yeah, sure. So just very quickly on the tactical voting, for visual illustration, go to the blog post that I did, that I posted in the chat earlier, and look at figure 2 and look at the orange line, which shows so the figure shows the seat to vote ratios for the different parties at every election since 1945. The orange line has the Liberal Democrats doing very, very badly, with not being able to translate its vote share into seat share at all well until this election, when woof, suddenly it goes up. So that's very clear evidence of successful tactical voting campaigning, and targeted campaigning. How much of that was due to luck, of course, and how much of it is an indication that parties have got better at this is an interesting question, and you need to speak to some Lib Dem campaigners in order to find that out. On voter ID, it's a bit early to say, I think, what the impact of voter ID has been, because it's hard to get good quality evidence on this. So basically, there are two kinds of evidence that we can get in order to understand the impact of voter ID. We can get evidence from people at the polling stations, polling clerks and others, on what they observed about people being turned away. But of course, that doesn't give you any evidence on the people who never bothered turning up in the first place. Or you can ask people in surveys, did you not vote as a result of the voter ID requirements. But that's also a problematic source of evidence. We know from decades of polling, one of the most consistent results in polling research is that people overstate their turnout at elections because turnout is socially a desirable thing to do. So if you haven't turned out, then now there's a new way of kind of having a socially acceptable response. Well, I couldn't because I didn't have voter ID. So we've had a poll from More in Common where they found that 3.2% of respondents said they had not voted because they didn't have valid ID. Who knows? It seems likely, given everything that we know about the history of the turnout question, that that is an overestimate. But who knows? So the Electoral Commission will be doing lots more research. They will have had evidence gathering going on at the polling stations. They'll also be doing survey research. And I think we should wait until we have that kind of more high quality evidence before we draw conclusions.
So the third question then was, I think probably particularly one for Sofia, which was about whether all these novice candidates could do with more sort of standardized training for them rather than just waiting until they get elected if they do.
Yes, well, parties are now first of all, they are things that you will be learning by training. So for example, on formal procedures, etc. But there are other things like the conventional rules, that are more convention that actually written and that you cannot provide real training for them. So things that you learn by doing and by observing other people doing and being part of the institution. So I think that, yes, there is a level of formal training that candidates should get, mainly on how to, like the first step is how to campaign. Then of course, if you're standing in a winnable seat, maybe, step up the training to make it more, like tailor-made to the functions that you are expected to be performing, especially very short after you get elected. But there are things that definitely training cannot really be doing, and it's only about providing support. Now, something that I think that definitely every candidate and parliamentarian should get training on is about how to diffuse conflict, and also, and I will elaborate in a second, but how to diffuse conflict and how to manage effective communication, as those has been seen as key to prevent abuse, harassment, and intimidation. So there is a lot of times what we see in interviews with parliamentarians is they confuse disagreement with abuse, and then sometimes go into the abusive terrain where they were only want to be disagreeing. So where is the line between becoming abusive, intimidated, and just having a robust argumentation has been a very difficult one to establish. And I think that for that, they do need, and also the same happened with the public. We need more courses on civic education, I think it was called, maybe in the 90s, that they were removed very later on, but that actually teaches people how to communicate properly when it's about politics and how to debate using proper language that will not become intimidating over time. And I think, so a lot of MPs and local councillors are asking now for training on how to diffuse conflict.
Maybe
especially
could I just,
with people.
Sorry, could I just add something on that? I think probably there are two different kinds of training to separate out here. It's very important to train and induct people who are going to be MPs, but you said there were 4,500 candidates, and clearly very many of them had little to no expectation of ever being an MP, but what they did all have in common was that they were candidates. And so exactly as you say, they're engaged in an electoral process, and some of the things that we've been complaining about here in terms of sort of civility and the culture of discourse, and also the use of evidence and so on in campaigns, I think it would be very good for there to be more of a basis for that. I mean, one of the things that I support for MPs is that they need to be made more aware of their constitutional and democratic responsibilities, rather than just, how to put down a question or, how to do their constituency work. They have an important role in our democracy, and clearly candidates do too. It's a slightly different role, but better preparation to do that well, I think, would be really valuable.
So yeah, I agree with all of that. I just wanted to come back on the voter ID thing, because I might have sounded as if I was suggesting that it doesn't matter that voter ID had an impact on turnout, and I just wanted to be clear it does matter. Even if 3.2% is an overestimate, it's still a significant issue. And so thinking about how to ease the system, and Labour's not going to abolish the requirement, but they really ought to be thinking about making it easier to fulfill that requirement.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we'll go back to Hannah then, another round of questions.
Yeah, we've got an anonymous question on the quality of candidates. There seem to be quite a high number of candidates being dropped by their parties during the election campaign, some for the kind of gambling scandal, but then also some when past comments or behaviour came to light. Is this a problem, and can anything be done to improve the scrutiny of candidates? Tom Brake from Unlock Democracy said, what can realistically be done about the abuse below the criminal threshold candidates receive? And he cites some responses that Unlock Democracy received from candidates in surveys which discuss both online abuse and aggressive behaviour on the doorstep. And Liz Spate said, what role do you think the proposed modernisation committee could play in improving the way that Parliament works for women and advance the gender-sensitive Parliament agenda, for example, looking at greater use of remote access or reviewing sitting hours?
Okay, great, loads there. So the first of those was about candidate quality. So I don't know if that's want to go straight back to Sofia on, perhaps.
So yeah, I mean, that is an interesting one. So candidate quality is also driven by what the parties think that voters want to see. So that's one thing. I mean, we need to scrutinize much more the selection process, that's for sure, but also look at who the selectorate is. So who is making, for many constituencies and for many candidates, actually, the selection process will be the only competitive part that they do, especially if they are standing in very safe seats. So we do need to scrutinize much more who are the selectors, and also how the selectors are collecting evidence of the possible candidates to select the best one. Now, the second thing is that during a snap election in particular, it was snap-ish because we kind of knew on a way that it was coming. The thing is just like, I think everybody was slightly unprepared of the timing coming over summer. But they were, for the main candidates, for example, Labour had already filled the majority of the candidates, but there are parties like Reform UK or the Conservative Party that had to deal with the Conservative Party and a large number of people standing down and not putting themselves forward again. And for Reform UK, I mean, they promised to fill every candidate in every constituency, but was that actually feasible without a proper vetting, like doing a proper vetting process in less than 2 weeks? Well, that's questionable. So unfortunately, the very nature of having snap elections actually make the quality of candidates like a challenge. Yeah, and definitely I think that the issue of the vetting scandals, etc., is just a manifestation of how for granted certain people were taking their participation in politics, and also perhaps a little bit reflects on the quality of the discussions that we are seeing in politics, and how discredited the political profession has been recently.
So it sounds like Conservative struggles there came from some of them being very unprepared for the election to be called, and some of them being a little bit over-prepared for the election to be called. Perhaps we might stay with you on the question of abuse that Tom Brake raised, and then perhaps Alan might have some thoughts on that. This question of things candidates might experience that fall slightly below the bar for what might be criminal, but might nonetheless be things that are challenging for them during campaigns that we might want to avoid.
Well, yes, it's true. In all the surveys, candidate, or in this general election survey that we conducted in 2019 and 2017, we have seen an increase in the number of candidates being abused, but also MPs. But also we have seen how this abuse, harassment, and intimidation manifest in different ways at different speeds. And one of the main challenges that have been identified for tackling the issue, also the issue of social media abuse, which is rife, also very, widespread, is how difficult it is to report that to police. So the Protection from Harassment Act establishes a threshold and clearly defines what harassment, abuse, and intimidation is. The problem is that it's upon the victim to really collect all the information before you go and and give it to the police. So the threshold is very high, and in the majority of the cases, the damage is already done before the police is compelled to act. Now, when the police also sometimes can identify threats as being, especially harmful or especially bad or especially serious, and they act quicker. But it is a problem to determine when and how the police really should intervene and when they shouldn't, and also how to collect all of this information. And the other thing is the fact that the law is used to have, and the police as well, one perpetrator, one victim, so to speak. But in the case of social media, for example, what we see is drops of people, like jumping into one person. So how can you really deal with the issue of having multiple perpetrators that sometimes are anonymized or are not very clear to identify? So I think that's why we do need to have a holistic approach to that emphasizes prevention and also attention.
Okay, great, thank you. Alan, was there anything you were going to add to that?
Yeah, I completely agree with Sofia. What Sofia has just said. I mean, you can have kind of direct interventions against specific instances of abuse, and then you can have more indirect interventions against the broader tenor of discourse. And there's limits to how much you can achieve only through the former. So focusing on the latter is incredibly important. And that involves education. It involves engaging with people and thinking about, as Sofia said earlier, how to engage in polite discourse and civilized discourse. It involves MPs and candidates themselves modeling good behavior. And as I mentioned in my talk, using the kind of discourse that became rather common on election night when the results were being announced during the campaign period instead. There was a really nice piece in the Times yesterday by Edward Lucas, who's a Times columnist, but was also a Lib Dem election candidate in this election. And he talked about an incident where he was confronted by someone on the doorstep saying, I would kill all of you. And he kind of said, well, do you really mean this? And she said, yeah, I really mean it. And he describes a process where he engaged with this person and found common ground, found issues where they agreed, and gradually had a more healthy conversation. And it ended up that this person kind of wished him well at the end of the conversation. Now, that voter was a frail octogenarian in his description. And, it's possible to imagine that kind of conversation in that context. He wasn't feeling physically threatened in that case. Clearly, there are many cases where candidates do feel physically threatened, and we cannot rely on the candidate alone to do the job of promoting that kind of discourse. So we have to engage at a wider level in helping people to understand how to listen to and respect other people. And I guess, we see across the Atlantic how terribly bad politics, badly wrong politics can go if you have polarization to the extent that people don't respect the other side at all, don't listen to the other side, regard the people on the other side as ogres. And we've been tempted in that direction several times of late in the UK, and we really mustn't go there. And we need action to address this. And I don't think at the moment politicians are really taking it as seriously as they should.
Craig, we've got very little time for what is nonetheless a very important question, which was about the Modernisation Committee.
And one close to your heart, Tom. Yes, I think the Modernisation Committee is going to have potentially a lot on its agenda, including the issues that Liz raises. I mean, we've seen concerns about the decline of scrutiny in recent years. There are some sort of rather nerdy technical things about how to improve the scrutiny of delegated legislation, for example, whether we want to change the way that we do private members' bills. And then we've got the range of challenges which have been mentioned in this forum about whether there are things that need to be done differently because you've got a fragmented opposition, because you've got a large government majority. So I think it's going to have a lot of things potentially to look at. And I hope that what it might begin by doing is consulting on what people want the priorities to be, including consulting MPs as well as people outside Parliament. And of course, we should remember that there's a House of Commons Procedure Committee as well, which will presumably look at some of these matters. And so there are potentially two committees sitting from the autumn. And one of the benefits, again, of having this lengthy period in between times is that we can all start thinking about these things. MPs, I imagine, will be doing more campaigning to be on these committees than ever has been done before, and trying to hone what their arguments are and what they are going to want to be prioritising if they get onto the committees. So there's lots of opportunities for influence here between now and the autumn.
Fascinating. Well, I think we could talk about this all afternoon, but unfortunately we are out of time. But before I ask you to join me in thanking the speakers, I just have a few quick bits of housekeeping. So as I mentioned at the start, the recording of this session will appear on our YouTube channel and podcast feed in the coming days. So please do subscribe to those. If you've not already signed up to our events mailing list, please do so in order to be the first to hear about our future events. You can find the sign up link on our website. But otherwise, it just leaves me to thank you all very much for attending this session today, and to thank our excellent panel of speakers for a fascinating discussion. Ben Lauderdale, Alan Renwick, Sofia Collignon, and Meg Russell. Thanks to Hannah for handling the questions, and to Ed Rowe for organising things behind the scenes. But otherwise, good afternoon, and I hope you'll attend another of our events very soon. Bye-bye.